by the rope that held Hacksaw Ridge, 1945. The rope had been tested 12 times that morning, but Desmond Doss ran his calloused fingers along its length once more, checking for frays that might send a wounded man plummeting 30 feet to the coral rocks below. Above him, the sheer face of Hacksaw Ridge rose like a wall of pocked limestone, rain-slick slopes gleaming under the overcast Okinawan sky. From the plateau beyond the rim came the occasional crack of sniper fire and the distant groans of men the 77th Infantry Division had been forced to leave behind. The failed assault 3 hours earlier had scattered wounded Americans across the ridgetop like broken toys. Now, as morning mist clung to the cliff face, 31 voices called down through the smoke and drizzle, some strong, others fading to whispers that made Doss's chest tighten with each passing minute. The other medics had withdrawn with the main force, following Lieutenant Morrison's direct order to fall back and regroup. But withdrawal meant abandoning men who still drew breath, and Doss found himself unable to reconcile that reality with the oath he'd sworn to preserve life. Private Henderson from Minnesota crouched beside him, nervously working the bolt of his rifle. "Doc, you sure about this? That rope's been holding stretchers all morning, but it ain't exactly Army regulation." Doss tested the knots one final time, his hands steady despite the tremor he felt in his chest. "It held the others. It'll hold." Others didn't weigh as much as some of those boys up there, and the Japs are still watching every inch of that rim. They let us pull back, but they ain't sleeping. The rain had started again, that fine Okinawan drizzle that turned everything slippery and made the rope feel like it might slide through a man's grip without warning. Doss adjusted his medical bag, lighter now after treating the walking wounded, but still containing enough bandages and morphine for perhaps a dozen more casualties. The technique he'd developed over the past 4 days had emerged from desperation. Crawl silently to each wounded soldier, apply field dressings without sound, then drag them to the cliff edge where the rope became their only path to safety. From the ridge above came a weak call. "Medic! Somebody! Please!" Henderson's grip tightened on his rifle. "Doc, we got orders. Lieutenant said, Lieutenant's not up there bleeding." Doss began his descent, boots searching for purchase on the wet coral. The 30-foot cliff face stretched below him, every handhold a calculated risk, every movement potentially his last if a Japanese sniper decided the morning had been too quiet. But the voices from above pulled him upward with a force stronger than gravity, and his hands found their rhythm on the rope that connected the wounded to salvation. The first man he reached was Corporal Williams, a machine gunner who'd been conscious for 2 days, lying behind a shattered tree stump that provided minimal cover from enemy observation. Williams grabbed Doss's sleeve with surprising strength. "They're still out there, Doc, in the caves about 50 yards east. They've been watching us, waiting." Doss applied fresh bandages to Williams's shoulder wound, working entirely by touch to avoid unnecessary movement. "How many more?" "Saw at least 3 others moving when the mortar round hit. Johnson's in bad shape, maybe 20 yards that way. Morrison's further out near the big crater." Each name was another weight added to Doss's conscience, another calculation of time versus safety, another prayer whispered between heartbeats. He fashioned a crude harness from rifle slings and medical tape, creating a system that would allow him to lower Williams while climbing beside him. The rope, already showing signs of wear from the morning's rescues, would have to hold just a little longer. The descent with Williams took 8 agonizing minutes, both men exposed against the cliff face while Japanese positions remained ominously silent. Every foot of progress brought them closer to Henderson's anxious face below, but also tested the rope's integrity with each shifting of weight. Halfway down, one of the rifle slings began to slip, forcing Doss to stop and retie the entire assembly while hanging from handholds carved into the coral by previous explosions. When they finally reached the bottom, Henderson helped carry Williams to the makeshift aid station 50 yards back from the cliff base. The rear area medic, a tired sergeant from Ohio, looked up from bandaging another casualty. "How many more up there?" "Too many." "Doc, you're pushing luck that don't exist. That rope's gonna snap, and then we lose you too." But Doss was already checking his remaining supplies, calculating morphine doses and tourniquet applications. The voices from above hadn't stopped, and each minute of delay meant someone growing weaker, losing more blood, sliding closer to the edge where no rope could reach them. He looked at Henderson, who was staring at the cliff face with an expression caught between admiration and horror. "You don't have to come back up." Henderson laughed, but it sounded hollow. "Hell, Doc, somebody's got to watch your back while you're saving everybody else's." If stories like this make you imagine what you'd do under fire, tell us in the comments how you think you'd react in this situation. And stay with us for the next chapters. The second ascent revealed how thoroughly the Japanese had prepared Hacksaw Ridge for exactly this kind of rescue operation. As Doss hauled himself over the rim, he could see fresh spider holes carved into the coral, positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire across the plateau, where the wounded lay scattered. The enemy hadn't withdrawn. They'd simply melted back into positions that turned every movement into a calculated gamble with death. Henderson followed close behind, his breathing sharp and controlled. The Minnesota farm boy had proven steadier under fire than anyone expected, but Doss could see the strain building in his movements. They communicated through hand signals now, having learned that voices carried too clearly across the broken ground of Hacksaw Ridge. The plateau stretched before them like a moonscape of shell craters and splintered trees. Johnson lay pinned beneath a fallen log near the eastern edge, his leg clearly broken and his breathing coming in painful gasps. Beyond him, near the massive crater Williams had mentioned, Doss could see the outline of another motionless figure. How many wounded were still breathing? How many had slipped into unconsciousness while he'd been making the first rescue? They moved in a crouch from crater to crater, following mental maps Doss had sketched during his previous trips up the cliff. The rain continued, providing some acoustic cover but making every surface treacherous. Henderson carried extra bandages and a field telephone wire they could use as backup if the main rope failed. His respect for Doss had grown with each descent, but so had his fear of what would happen when the medic's luck finally ran out. Movement. East side. Henderson's whisper froze them both behind a coral outcropping. Across the plateau, a shadow shifted near one of the cave mouths. Not American. The movement was too deliberate, too careful. Someone was watching, waiting, making calculations about when to reveal themselves. The Japanese forces had shown tactical patience throughout the Okinawa campaign, and Hacksaw Ridge represented their defensive philosophy at its most brutal. Let the Americans come, then make them pay for every yard of advance. Johnson's condition proved worse than expected. The fallen log had crushed his left leg in 2 places, and Doss suspected internal injuries from the way the young soldier favored his right side. Working in complete silence, he applied a splint using broken rifle parts and medical tape, then began the painstaking process of freeing Johnson from the debris. Every movement had to remain controlled, deliberate, invisible to watchers who might be tracking their location through rifle scopes. Henderson helped lift the log while Doss pulled Johnson clear. The soldier bit down on a piece of cloth to muffle his groans, understanding instinctively that sound meant death for all 3 of them. Together, they began the crawl back toward the rope, Johnson's weight distributed between them, progress measured in yards rather than the confident strides they'd taken during training exercises back in the States. The rope showed new signs of strain when they reached it. Individual strands had begun snapping under repeated stress, leaving Doss to calculate whether each rescue might be the one that sent multiple men plummeting to their deaths. But Johnson needed immediate medical attention, and the aid station below represented his only chance of survival. They rigged the makeshift stretcher system, tested the knots, and began another agonizing descent down the face of Hacksaw Ridge. Halfway down, the stretcher assembly began to fail. One of the rifle stocks splintered with a sound like breaking bone, forcing Doss to support Johnson's full weight while Henderson scrambled to retie the support straps. For 30 seconds, they hung suspended against the cliff face, completely exposed, held by a rope that seemed to grow thinner with each heartbeat. Japanese snipers could have ended the rescue with a single shot, but the enemy positions remained mysteriously quiet. When they finally reached the bottom, the rear area medic shook his head at the sight of the deteriorating rope. "Doc, this thing's about done. You take it up there many more times, it's gonna kill somebody." Doss looked back at the cliff face, mentally counting the voices he'd heard from above. At least 6 more wounded Americans lay scattered across the plateau, some conscious enough to understand their situation, others barely clinging to life. Each represented a name, a hometown, a family waiting for news that might never come. The rope might fail, but abandoning them guaranteed their deaths. "We'll make it hold." Henderson checked his ammunition and adjusted his helmet. "How long you figure before they start shooting at us regular?" "Don't know, but we're going back up." The technique was evolving with each rescue, born of necessity and refined by desperation. Move during artillery barrages when noise provided cover. Freeze during quiet moments when any sound might reveal positions. Communicate through touch and whispers. Apply tourniquets and field dressings in complete darkness when necessary. Turn every piece of equipment into potential rescue gear. Rifle slings became harnesses, helmet straps became bandages, shelter halves became stretchers. Above them, the voices continued calling down through the rain and mist of Hacksaw Ridge, each one a test of conscience against the brutal mathematics of survival. By the third ascent, exhaustion had become Doss's most dangerous enemy. His hands shook uncontrollably as he tested the rope's remaining strength, and his vision blurred from dehydration despite the constant Okinawan drizzle. The cliff face of Hacksaw Ridge had claimed pieces of him with each rescue: skin from his palms, strength from his arms, confidence from his ability to judge distance and risk accurately. Henderson moved beside him with the mechanical precision of a man pushing beyond normal endurance. The Minnesota farm boy had stopped making jokes about Doss's faith or his refusal to carry a weapon. Instead, he'd begun whispering his own prayers during the worst moments, asking for strength to keep climbing, keep lifting, keep believing that the rope would hold for just one more wounded soldier. The plateau revealed new horrors with each trip. Sergeant Morrison lay near the massive crater, bleeding from a stomach wound that required immediate attention. His breathing came in shallow gasps, and his eyes tracked their movement with the desperate awareness of a man who understood his situation completely. Beyond him, 2 more figures remained motionless near the eastern edge, too distant to determine if they still lived, but close enough to represent additional weight on Doss's conscience. "Doc, we're going to lose him if we don't move fast." Henderson's assessment was accurate. Morrison needed surgery, not field medicine, but the aid station below represented his only chance of survival. Doss applied pressure bandages and administered morphine while calculating how to transport a man in Morrison's condition without killing him during the descent. The rope alone couldn't safely support a soldier who might lose consciousness during the lowering process. Working with desperate efficiency, they fashioned a crude stretcher using 2 broken rifle stocks and a shelter half. The contraption looked fragile enough to disintegrate under normal handling, but it distributed Morrison's weight more evenly than the harness system they'd used for previous rescues. Every knot became critical, every support strap a potential failure point that might send all 3 men tumbling down the cliff face. The Japanese positions had grown more active as the morning progressed. Occasional sniper fire cracked across the plateau, and mortar rounds exploded randomly in the distance, but the enemy seemed unable to pinpoint exactly where the rescues were taking place. Doss's silent approach had kept them invisible to observers who knew Americans were on the plateau, but couldn't track their precise movements through the smoke and rain. As they prepared to lower Morrison, Henderson grabbed Doss's arm. "They're talking about pulling the whole company back to regimental reserve. Word is, Hacksaw Ridge ain't worth the casualties. What about the wounded? Official word is to write them off. Tactical withdrawal, consolidate positions. Try again next week with fresh troops." The information hit Doss like a physical blow. Official abandonment meant no more rescue attempts, no more rope lowering wounded soldiers to safety, no more hope for the voices still calling down from the plateau above. It also meant that what they were doing had become not just dangerous, but explicitly against orders from higher command. How much time before they enforced the withdrawal? Lieutenant Morrison said maybe 2 hours before they start pulling security back from this sector. Morrison's condition deteriorated during their conversation. His breathing grew more labored, and blood seeped through the pressure bandages despite Doss's efforts to control the hemorrhaging. They began the descent immediately, the improvised stretcher creaking ominously as it took the wounded sergeant's full weight. One of the rifle stocks developed a hairline crack that widened with each foot of vertical progress. Halfway down the cliff face, the stretcher assembly began to fail completely. The shelter half tore along one edge, and the cracked rifle stock threatened to snap entirely. Doss found himself supporting Morrison's weight directly, his burned hands gripping the rope while Henderson struggled to redistribute the load through the remaining support straps. For 2 agonizing minutes, they hung motionless against Hacksaw Ridge, held by equipment that seemed certain to fail. When they finally reached the aid station, the rear area medic looked up from treating previous casualties with an expression that mixed admiration and horror. 3 wounded soldiers lay on stretchers, bandaged and sedated, waiting for evacuation to the field hospital. The small tent that served as their treatment area had become overcrowded, understaffed, and critically low on medical supplies. "Doc, I got word from battalion. They're calling off rescue operations on this sector. Too dangerous, too many casualties, not enough tactical value." Doss stared at the frayed rope, calculating how many more trips it might sustain before structural failure made further rescues impossible. Morrison needed immediate surgery, but at least 5 more wounded Americans remained scattered across the plateau above. Each represented a choice between following orders and following conscience, between tactical wisdom and moral obligation. Henderson cleaned his rifle methodically, checking each component with the focus of a man preparing for the most important work of his life. "How many more you figure we can get before that rope gives out completely?" "Don't know. But we're going to find out." Above them, carried on the wind and rain of Hacksaw Ridge, the voices continued calling for help that might never come. Would you follow the orders exactly, or trust what your own eyes and instincts tell you in a moment like this? Comment which path you'd take, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. The rope snapped on the 27th rescue. Doss felt it go as he lowered Private Collins, a 19-year-old radioman from Georgia whose legs had been mangled by mortar fragments. The initial jolt sent both men swinging against the cliff face of Hacksaw Ridge, Collins crying out despite his efforts to remain silent, Doss scrambling to find handholds in the pocked coral as they plummeted the final 8 feet to the rocky ledge below. Henderson caught them both, his own body absorbing the impact that might have killed Collins outright. For 30 seconds, all 3 men lay tangled in the remains of the rope system that had lowered 26 wounded soldiers to safety over 4 impossible days. Above them, the plateau of Hacksaw Ridge stretched like an accusation. At least 4 more wounded Americans lay scattered across that killing ground, now unreachable by conventional means. The rear area medic examined Collins while casting worried glances at Doss's rope-burned hands. "Doc, that's it. You done what you could, but the equipment's finished. No way to get anybody else down from up there." Doss studied the cliff face with eyes that had learned to read every crack and outcropping as potential rescue routes. 30 feet of vertical coral rock, rain slick and exposed to enemy observation, but not impossible for a single man moving without the weight of lowering others. The voices from above had grown weaker during the afternoon, some fading to whispers that might stop entirely if help didn't reach them soon. "There's another way." Henderson followed his gaze up the cliff face and understood immediately. "Doc, you're talking about free climbing. No rope, no safety line, no way to bring anybody down except by carrying them. Fireman's carry. Done it in training." Training wasn't on Hacksaw Ridge with Japs shooting at you. The tactical situation had deteriorated throughout the afternoon. Japanese forces had begun probing attacks against other sectors of the 77th Infantry Division's line, drawing attention and resources away from rescue operations. Word from battalion headquarters indicated that Hacksaw Ridge would be abandoned entirely within 6 hours, the position deemed too costly to hold against determined enemy resistance. But abandonment meant death for every wounded soldier still lying on the plateau above. Doss checked his medical supplies, enough bandages for emergency treatment, morphine for pain management, water for soldiers who'd been lying under the Okinawan sun for hours without relief. Not enough to save everyone, but perhaps enough to keep them alive until a more substantial rescue could be organized. The free climb took 12 minutes of careful progress, each handhold tested before committing his full weight to the coral formations that might crumble under stress. Without the rope's security, every movement became a calculation of risk versus necessity, with death waiting below for any mistake in judgment. But the technique also allowed him to move more quietly, approaching the plateau rim from an angle that avoided the most obvious observation points. The first wounded soldier he reached was Corporal Davis, a squad leader who'd been conscious throughout the 4-day ordeal. Davis grabbed Doss's shirt as the medic applied fresh bandages to a shoulder wound that had been bleeding slowly but steadily. "Doc, there's 3 more. Williams is bad hurt, maybe 50 yards east. Johnson's unconscious near the big crater. Thompson's been quiet for an hour." Each name represented another impossible carry down the cliff face, another test of strength and technique that pushed beyond the limits of normal human endurance. But Davis weighed perhaps 160 pounds, manageable for a fireman's carry if Doss could maintain his footing on the descent. They began immediately, Davis biting down on cloth to muffle his groans as Doss positioned him across his shoulders and began the careful climb down. The descent required 23 minutes and left both men shaking from exhaustion and terror. Davis's weight shifted constantly, threatening to unbalance them both and send them tumbling down the cliff face. Halfway down, Japanese sniper fire cracked overhead, forcing them to freeze against the rock while bullets sparked off coral inches from their position. For 5 endless minutes, they hung motionless while an enemy marksman tried to pin them down. Henderson waited below with medical supplies and water, his face showing the strain of watching each precarious descent. "Doc, battalion's moving up the withdrawal timeline. Lieutenant says maybe 2 more hours before they pull all security back from this sector." "How many more up there?" 3, maybe 4. "But Doc, you're about done. Your hands are torn up, you're shaking, and that climb's going to kill you before you save anybody else." Doss examined his hands in the fading afternoon light. The rope burns had opened into raw wounds that bled steadily, and his fingers cramped when he tried to grip anything securely. But Williams, Johnson and Thompson still lay on the plateau above, their voices growing weaker with each passing hour. Each represented a choice between physical limitations and moral obligation, between tactical sense and the oath he'd sworn to preserve life. The second free climb revealed how completely exhaustion had compromised his judgment. Twice he nearly lost his grip on handholds that should have been secure, saved only by instinct and desperation. Williams lay semi-conscious near the eastern edge of the plateau, his breathing shallow and irregular. Too weak to assist during the carry, but still alive, still savable if Doss could make one more impossible descent. They began the climb down as evening shadows crept across Hacksaw Ridge, the fading light making each handhold a guess rather than a certainty. Williams's dead weight shifted constantly, and Doss felt his strength failing with each foot of vertical progress. 20 feet down, his right hand slipped on wet coral, sending them both sliding down the cliff face until his boots found purchase on a narrow ledge. For the space of 3 heartbeats, they balanced on the edge of disaster. Williams unconscious, Doss clinging to handholds that might give way at any moment, Henderson calling up from below with encouragement that sounded like prayers. Then muscle memory and stubborn faith took over, carrying them down the final 20 feet to safety and the growing collection of wounded soldiers who owed their lives to a rope that had finally failed. The central secret that Desmond Doss carried for the rest of his life had nothing to do with courage. It was about the moment, halfway up his final climb, when he stopped believing he could save anyone else and climbed anyway. Thompson lay motionless near the massive crater where mortar rounds had churned Hacksaw Ridge into a landscape of coral fragments and twisted metal. Doss had been climbing for 6 hours, his hands so damaged that he left bloody fingerprints on every handhold, his legs trembling uncontrollably from exhaustion. The rational part of his mind had been screaming retreat for the past hour, calculating the overwhelming probability that this climb would end with 2 dead medics instead of 1 rescued soldier. But Thompson's chest still rose and fell with the shallow breathing of severe head trauma, and Doss found himself unable to reconcile that sight with the idea of climbing back down alone. Faith had carried him through the first 26 rescues, but this final ascent was powered by something darker, a refusal to let mathematics determine which lives deserved saving and which could be written off as acceptable losses. Henderson had tried to stop him. The Minnesota farm boy had grabbed Doss's arm as he prepared for the climb, his face showing the kind of desperate loyalty that develops between men who've shared impossible circumstances. "Doc, you're done. You saved 28 men today. Thompson's probably gone anyway, and you're going to kill yourself trying to prove something that don't need proving." He's still breathing. Breathing ain't living, not with head wounds like that. But Doss had already begun the ascent, his damaged hands finding their rhythm on handholds that had become as familiar as prayer. The cliff face of Hacksaw Ridge had claimed pieces of him throughout the day, but it had also taught him lessons about balance, about finding strength in technique when raw power failed, about continuing to move when stopping meant accepting the unacceptable. Thompson's condition was worse than expected. The young soldier had taken shrapnel to the skull, and his left arm hung at an impossible angle. Moving him risked causing additional damage, but leaving him guaranteed death when the 77th Infantry Division completed its withdrawal from the sector. Doss applied what medical treatment he could: pressure bandages for the head wound, a rough splint for the broken arm, morphine for pain management that might ease Thompson's final hours. The descent represented the purest distillation of everything Doss had learned about rescue technique and human endurance. Thompson's dead weight shifted constantly, threatening to drag them both off the cliff face. Blood from Doss's hands made every grip uncertain, and exhaustion had progressed beyond fatigue into something approaching physical shutdown. But muscle memory and desperate improvisation carried them down foot by foot, handhold by handhold, breath by breath. 15 feet from the bottom, Doss's right leg gave out entirely. Cramped muscles simply stopped responding to conscious control, leaving him hanging from handholds that grew slippery with blood and rain. Thompson's weight pulled them toward a fall that would kill both men, while Henderson climbed frantically up from below to provide assistance that arrived just seconds before total collapse. Together, they lowered Thompson to the aid station where the rear area medic worked, with supplies stretched beyond all reasonable limits. 29 wounded soldiers lay on stretchers and improvised bedding, bandaged and medicated, waiting for evacuation that might never come. The small tent had become a testament to what determination could accomplish when supported by equipment that should have failed hours earlier. Doc, Thompson's unconscious, but his vitals are stable. You might have saved him, but it's going to be touch and go for days. Doss stared at his hands, no longer able to make fists, the rope burns and climbing wounds having destroyed most of the skin on his palms. But 29 Americans who would have died on Hacksaw Ridge were breathing, receiving medical care, and waiting for transport to field hospitals where surgery might complete what field medicine had started. Henderson sat beside him, checking his own equipment with the methodical focus of a man trying to process impossible experience. "Doc, what you did up there, I ain't got words for it, but I need to ask you something, and I need you to be straight with me." "What? How many times today did you think you weren't going to make it back down?" The question cut straight to the secret Doss would carry for decades. That heroism, as experienced from the inside, felt nothing like the stories that would later be written about Hacksaw Ridge. It felt like terror barely held in check, like faith tested beyond its breaking point, like the constant calculation of whether the next handhold would support a man's weight or send him tumbling to his death. Every time. But you kept climbing anyway. Had to. They were still breathing. That night, as medical evacuations finally began and wounded soldiers were loaded onto stretchers for transport to rear area hospitals, Doss discovered that heroism carried a price beyond physical injury. His hands shook uncontrollably whenever he tried to grip anything. The sound of rope sliding through rings sent him into cold sweats. And when he closed his eyes, he saw the cliff face of Hacksaw Ridge stretching endlessly above him, populated by wounded soldiers calling for help he might no longer be able to provide. The official report would compress the day into clean sentences about tactical withdrawal, casualty evacuation, and individual initiative under fire. But the reality lived in damaged hands and recurring nightmares, in the knowledge that saving lives sometimes required accepting that you might not survive the attempt, and that the mathematics of war made heroes out of men who simply refused to stop climbing when stopping made rational sense. 43 years later, Desmond Doss sat on his front porch in Alabama, listening to rain drum against the roof with the same irregular rhythm that had marked his final hours on Hacksaw Ridge. His hands, permanently scarred from rope burns and coral cuts, rested carefully in his lap, while a young historian adjusted her recording equipment and prepared to ask questions about the day that had defined his legend. "Mr. Doss, the citation mentions 31 rescued soldiers, but some accounts suggest the number might have been higher. Can you clarify the exact count?" He studied his damaged palms, remembering the weight of each body he'd carried and the feel of rope sliding through bleeding fingers. The numbers had always been approximate: wounded soldiers pulled from shell craters, lowered down cliff faces, carried through rain and sniper fire to aid stations that operated beyond their capacity. Some had survived the evacuation to field hospitals. Others had died despite reaching medical care. All of them had taught him lessons about the difference between salvation and rescue. Numbers don't tell the story. What I remember is faces and voices, and the way that rope felt when it was about to give out. The historian nodded, making notes about details that couldn't be captured in official reports. "The other veterans I've interviewed mentioned that you continued climbing even after the rope failed. Can you describe what that was like?" "Scary. Everything about that ridge was scary. But scary don't change the fact that somebody needs help." What he didn't tell her was about the nightmares that had visited his sleep for decades. Dreams where the cliff face stretched infinitely upward, populated by wounded soldiers he could never quite reach. Or the way his hands still trembled when he tied knots, muscle memory recalling the sensation of rope fibers snapping under impossible weight. Or how the smell of wet canvas could transport him instantly back to that aid station tent where 29 Americans had waited for evacuation while he calculated whether his strength would last for one more impossible climb. The rain intensified, and Doss found himself listening to its rhythm with the attention he'd once reserved for enemy movement on contested ridges. Weather in Alabama carried different meanings than the monsoon patterns that had swept across Okinawa, but precipitation still triggered memories of slippery handholds and reduced visibility that could hide both rescue opportunities and sniper positions. The men you served with speak about you with tremendous respect, but also with a kind of protective attitude. They seem concerned about how your story gets told. Henderson had visited 2 months earlier, the Minnesota farm boy now grown into a grandfather who still moved with the careful precision of someone who'd learned to navigate dangerous ground. They'd talked about weather and farming and grandchildren, avoiding direct discussion of Hacksaw Ridge until evening shadows triggered memories neither man could entirely control. Some things are hard to explain to people who weren't there. What we did on that ridge, it wasn't heroic while it was happening. It was just necessary. Henderson had agreed, adding details about fear and improvisation that never appeared in official accounts. How they'd learned to communicate through touch when voices might attract sniper fire, how they'd converted every piece of equipment into potential rescue gear, rifle slings, helmet straps, shelter halves, medical tape. How the rope had become not just a tool, but a lifeline connecting wounded soldiers to the possibility of another day. The historian consulted her notes, searching for questions that might illuminate the gap between legend and lived experience. Mr. Doss, you've mentioned in other interviews that your faith sustained you during the rescue operations. Can you elaborate on what that meant practically? Prayer was like checking the rope. Something you did before each climb, during the difficult parts, and after you made it down alive, asking for strength, for steady hands, for the rope to hold just a little longer. But faith had also meant wrestling with questions that had no comfortable answers. Why had he survived when younger, stronger men had died from wounds less severe than what he'd endured? Why had the rope held for 26 rescues and failed on the 27th? Why had his hands healed enough to allow normal function while other veterans carried disabilities that shadowed their entire lives? The rain began to slack off, leaving behind the kind of humid quiet that reminded him of morning patrols in the Pacific Theater. Somewhere in the distance, a car door slammed, and Doss found himself automatically cataloguing the sound as friendly or potentially hostile, a habit developed during months when survival depended on reading acoustic signatures correctly. The Medal of Honor citation describes your actions as conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity. How do those words match your memory of what happened? Big words for simple choices. Somebody needs help, you help them. Somebody's bleeding, you stop the bleeding. Somebody's trapped, you get them out. The rest is just paperwork. What the citation couldn't capture was the texture of terror barely held in check, the way faith and technique had combined to make impossible rescues seem routine, the knowledge that each climb might end with his body broken on the coral rocks below, or how the sound of wounded soldiers calling medic could still wake him from sleep decades later, his damaged hands reaching automatically for medical supplies that no longer hung from his belt. The historian gathered her equipment as afternoon shadows lengthened across the Alabama countryside. Before leaving, she asked one final question that cut straight to the heart of what Hacksaw Ridge had cost and what it had meant. If you could speak to young people today about courage and faith under pressure, what would you want them to understand? Doss looked at his scarred hands, remembering the weight of rope and the feel of coral handholds, the voices calling from above, and the tremor in his chest as he tested knots one final time before beginning climbs that defied rational calculation. Heroes are just people who keep climbing when the rope breaks. And the rope always breaks, sooner or later. What matters is what you do next. That evening, as rain continued to fall against his roof, Doss sat quietly with his memories of a cliff face in Okinawa, where 31 Americans had learned the difference between being saved and being rescued. and where one unarmed medic had discovered that legend was light compared to the weight of actually living through the moments that create it. If this story reminded you that behind every medal there's a human being carrying memories we'll never fully see, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story.